The Splinter Cell franchise has been one of my favorite game series of all time, but admittedly, I got into the games rather late. Being that for the entirety of the sixth generation, I only had a PlayStation 2, and also probably being that I was, 8 years old during the time the original Splinter Cell came out, I never got into the series beforehand. And it wasn't until Splinter Cell Conviction came out and seeing all the marketing behind that game, watching the presentations for it during the E3 conferences, that I finally jumped into the franchise and I just fell completely in love with the entire experience. Having missed such a large chunk of the games, though, I couldn't wait to go back and play the earlier iterations in the franchise, and today we're taking a look at the fourth entry, Splinter Cell Double Agent, which is running at native 4K with auto HDR via backwards compatibility on Xbox Series X. Now, before I start talking about my personal experience with the game, I wanted to touch upon a very important bit of information. Now, back during the time that this game came out, it was a cross-generation release on Xbox 360, as well as the original Xbox and PlayStation 2. Now, in today's market, this usually means that the games are comparable but downgraded graphically and performance-wise on the older hardware. But in Double Agent's case, this is a bit of an outlier, and actually, from what I remember, it wasn't all too rare to see cross-generation games or even cross-platform games not exactly have complete parity between their releases on the original target platforms. So in Double Agent's case, this version I'll be talking about is the Xbox 360 release. But if you played this game on the original Xbox, you got a completely different experience and almost a completely different game. I'm not too sure of all the changes they made, but different studios worked on these different versions of the game, and there are story elements that are present here in the 360 release that are completely different to the original Xbox release. And even parts of the levels in the game are further expanded upon or replaced entirely with different levels in the original Xbox version. What's even more interesting is that this game was first released on Xbox 360, and I believe a few weeks or a month later, they released it on last-gen systems. So respectively, you may think that the 360 release is the intended version, being the fact that it released first, but it's actually largely believed and promoted by fans of the franchise that the original Xbox release is in fact a better version of the game and stays more true to the roots of what Splinter Cell has always been about. So it's a very interesting dynamic and something that we don't see happen anymore these days, but back then that was something that did crop up from time to time. So with that being said, let me discuss my thoughts on Double Agent. Although I was aware of what I just mentioned going into this game, I wasn't aware of the core changes that they made, and still to this day I haven't really looked into them thoroughly. So I wanted to give my take here on the game being as objective and unskewed in my opinion as possible, rather than do a comparison between the two versions or go at this from the perspective of knowing ahead of time why this version of the game was inferior and why it wouldn't have been as complete of an experience compared to the original Xbox release. Honestly, though, I had a great time with Double Agent on 360, and it's a very different game in both its pacing and narrative cues to the later Splinter Cell games I was accustomed to. It's got real player choice with real consequences in this experience and has you tasked with sneaking around heavily guarded areas and war zones, trying to complete your objective and not alert anyone to your presence. Now, the entire perspective of this game is that you're playing Sam Fisher working undercover for a terrorist Splinter Cell group. Now, while you're undercover, you will have to make serious choices that are honestly quite difficult to make as they challenge your point of view and being more empathetic or resilient in completing your objective. Sometimes these choices you make involve people you work with getting hurt. You'll come face to face with the bad guys and they will challenge your commitment to their cause as they're asking you to do some pretty awful things. All while this is ongoing, you have to keep in contact with the government and you're doing your best not to piss them off as well. And sometimes they ask you things that go against the terrorist group. So it's this really interesting dynamic, and conceptually, this sounds just incredible because you have to carefully complete your task at the enemy's HQ, making sure you're not being seen, making sure they continually trust you, and ensuring that the government, the people that you work for, don't consider you a lost cause or that you've gone AWOL. I absolutely love the execution here, and I honestly think the studio did a great job at making sure that each decision has consequences and having to work both sides and do things that unsettle you. You know, it's a very smart and strategic experience that requires just delicate problem solving and thinking skills. I honestly had a great time with the mechanics of this gameplay concept, and I think the developers really did a solid job at conveying these choices to you and presenting you with various different situations where there's really no clear good answer, either from the bad guys or the good guys. There's lots of shades of gray with the decision making of this game, and you sort of have to contend with what you think is best in the present situation, and it's never going to be ideal. Now, while that's happening in the background, you're going to be navigating through these incredible levels. They're designed pretty well. They take you to exotic locations from around the world, and you'll have to sneak your way through, being as discreet as possible without being made by the enemies. There is a fail state in this game, so it's not completely dynamic where if you fail or get seen in the game, it just continues and you have a completely different situation and missions to combat this. Rather, you see a fail screen, you restart it, you try it again until you succeed. So while that previous concept that I just mentioned seems super ambitious, I can actually see a system like this maturing into a game like that, and that really excited me about this game. The prospect of someone making something truly dynamic where, yeah, if you're seen, it just continues, and you have to just deal with the situation at hand, come up with interesting excuses that also have consequences to their actions. Like, this is very, very exciting stuff, and something I think that, you know, a lot of people haven't really put a lot of attention into, especially with games today. Now, this being an older Splinter Cell title, I was worried that the controls wouldn't be so intuitive and I was going to have a rough time adjusting to the pacing of this game. Now, while the game doesn't play quite as fluid as Conviction or Blacklist, I wouldn't call the game unplayable by any means. It's a pretty good control system, but it does take some time and you will need to be more patient with it than some of the newer, more recent titles. So allow yourself to take your time. Sam here moves at a much slower pace than the other games. In fact, I would say it's a pretty realistic interpretation of stealth because sound plays an important role depending on how fast you move. Enemies have good vision. Even stuff like lighting and shadows are actually a part of the game's stealth dynamics. So it feels like a much more deliberate, albeit realistic take on the stealth genre compared to the newer games, which incorporate a lot of more fast-paced action elements in them, likely to appeal to a wider audience. Now, visually, I must say this game is quite the looker. Ubisoft games, especially these older launch year titles for Xbox 360, they all just look fantastic. I think Ubisoft in particular was really one of the few developers that were trying to utilize next generation technology, and it's such a beautiful game made even more beautiful running at native 4K on the Series X here. You'll see stuff like sweat glisten off Sam's face. The character models are all very appreciable in their detail, containing good skin texture, good clothing texture, and facial animations. The environments are stunning. You're seeing me sneak through a Hong Kong high-rise right now, and there's beautiful reflections off the windows, the way the hotel interior is designed. It all just places you at the heart of being in these amazing locations. And the detail of the levels is appreciable no matter what style of the environment you're in. There's snow levels, there's Middle Eastern war zones, there's facilities, lots of variety here, and every level looks fantastic and varies in size as well. I think if you play this today, you'll be quite surprised that the game really looked like this, being a first-year title on the Xbox 360. And all the Series X is doing is increasing the resolution to take care of all the issues with aliasing, but detail remains remarkably high throughout. Great sound as well. You can hear enemies far away in the environment. There's some action-focused scenes that solidly use the bass. It's a great visual and audible experience throughout, and the production value was clearly very high for this game. It's just a shame to me that fans really don't care for this version of the game, or I suppose rather that the real shame is that there's major differences between the different generational versions, because you can clearly see the love and attention to detail poured into every crevice of this game. The production values are crazy. It's a beautiful experience. So I really loved Splinter Cell Double Agent, and I think when you have nothing to compare it to, when you're just looking at this game face value, it's another great entry in the series, made even greater by the enhancements of this running backwards compatible on Xbox Series X. It clearly had a lot of love and care put into it, and it remains playable, albeit transitioning yourself to a slower pace of controls and reactions. I just had a great time with the game. I'm not sure if I'll ever pick up the original Xbox version and review that separately, but I have missed the Splinter Cell series for so long now. And I'm just so happy that we're getting a full-blown remake of the very first game on current-gen systems. And I'm very happy that regardless of how long it's now taken Ubisoft to bring this series back, I'm glad they didn't try to ruin it like they did with Rainbow Six and even to some degree Ghost Recon, which, let's just be honest, their modern entries are shells of their former selves and just represent nothing in the way of the core experience those games had offered previously. I just really think that the reason we haven't seen a new Splinter Cell game all these years later is because Ubisoft didn't really know how to do the Assassin's Creed Far Cry formula with a Splinter Cell game, and to make it like essentially an open world stealth loot driven game. And I'm just glad that version of a Splinter Cell doesn't exist. And even though it's not a new entry, a remake of the first game being made instead is just something I cannot wait for myself. So I hope you guys enjoyed this reminiscing video. I'm curious, very curious actually, to hear your detailed thoughts on Double Agent, whether you played this game on Xbox 360 or on the previous gen release. I'll be happy to read all your comments and respond accordingly. So I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.